none of them characterize this as American.
Oh, really? Hello everyone, this is Mark Peterson again with the Frog Outside the Well Research Center. Today my guest again is Kirk Larsen.
Happy to be back.
And Kirk is a professor of history, specializing in Chinese and Korean history at BYU. Did his PhD at Harvard. And a few weeks ago, we both did a conference at the University of Utah, sponsored by Seoul National University and University of Utah. And Kirk gave a presentation there on USS, or just SS?
Neither, as we'll see.
Oh, the General Sherman. 한국말로 셔먼호에, 사건. And he gave a lot of interesting details of how history has the General Sherman almost completely wrong in many, many regards. So tell us about it. What's wrong with the way we generally look at the Sherman incident?
Well, before I get into a couple of the little, what I call stubborn misapprehensions, things that we got wrong and we just can't seem to correct and get right, I want to talk about one bigger picture thing, and that is the significance or the role that this particular event plays in the understanding of relations between Korea and the United States.
Oh yeah, because Kim Il-sung's grandfather?
Great-grandfather.
Allegedly.
Allegedly, yes.
Was one of the leaders to burn
to attack the ship.
Yeah.
So just a tiny bit of background. The General Sherman is the name of a merchant ship that sailed up the Taedong River in 1866.
A merchant ship with a general's name, which gives the impression that it's a warship.
Yeah, it sounds, and it was definitely it was well armed, and it sailed up the river. And every time they met with local Korean officials, the local Korean officials said, "Your presence here is illegal. Please go away." The ship refused to do it. It sailed all the way up to Pyongyang, ran aground on a sandbar, and then the crew got into some unfortunate encounters with local populace. Some people were killed, and ultimately the Korean soldiers and the local populace gets together, attacks the ship, burns it, and kills everyone on board. So a very violent encounter, and one that's remembered in Korea, especially North Korea, as the beginning of Korean-American relations, but one that's almost entirely forgotten in the United States. And I had a wonderful experience about now 15 years ago that really hit this home to me. When I was teaching at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., I was invited to give a presentation to the Korea desk of the State Department. So these are American diplomats tasked with handling relations between South Korea and the United States. And I was asked to talk about what should you know about Korean history to help do your job. And so I started out, I said, well, let's start in the beginning. And so I want to get a sense of your level of knowledge and understanding. So who can tell me under what circumstances, under what conditions did relations between Korea and the United States begin? And it was crickets chirping. And finally, one guy raised his hand and said, didn't we sign a treaty in 1883? And so no knowledge of this whatsoever, and even among diplomats tasked with understanding relations. 2 weeks later, I was in New York, and got to hear a talk given by Han Sung-yeol, who was then the North Korean representative to the United Nations. And he talked about what he characterized as 150 years of enmity between Korea and the United States. And after the talk, I went up and asked him the same question. I said, I'm a historian, I'm just curious, under what circumstances, under what conditions did Korean-American relations begin in your mind? No crickets chirping for him. He said, the General Sherman. That's where it began. And so from the beginning, we have very different levels of understanding and knowledge about these things. The first is that this was the first time the Koreans and Americans actually interacted or met each other. There actually were several contacts, face-to-face contacts between Koreans and Americans before this. The earliest one was probably in 1853 with an American whaling vessel that showed up on the Korean shore. They met with some local officials. They couldn't really communicate, and then they left. There were a couple of others after that. Most significantly, in the same year as the General Sherman before, in 1866, an American ship was shipwrecked. And its crew was treated very well by the Koreans. They were given food, they were given medicine, and then they were taken to the border with China, which is what Koreans typically did when strangers appeared on their shores. And then once they crossed the border into China, they were treated like criminals by the Chinese government and were imprisoned, and it took them forever to get out. And so they wrote back and said the Koreans were far kinder and more generous to us than the Chinese were. So there are ways that we could talk about the beginnings of Korean-American relations that would be much more benign than the violence of the General Sherman. The second misapprehension, and it gets back to your, is it the USS General Sherman, is the idea that the General Sherman was a steamship. Now, some of this is simply landlubbers not knowing that SS means steamship. but it does. And so if you say it's the SS General Sherman, that's a sign that you think it's a steamship. There was a steamship, this one here, the Princess Royal, that was actually made in Britain and it was sold to a private venture who renamed it the Sherman. So some people look at this ship, this steamship, and say that's the General Sherman that sailed up the Tatum River in 1866.
They Google a picture of it.
Right. They
see
look,
the steam, the smoke coming out. Say, this is the General Sherman.
This is the General Sherman. Unfortunately for that, this ship actually sank off of the coast of South Carolina about 8 years after the General Sherman incident.
Oh.
And the size is all wrong. There are all sorts of reasons why it's definitely not this. But the idea that General Sherman is a steamship and that it's particularly this ship has become very commonplace in both North and South Korean history textbooks, in popular media. I love this picture. This is the Shincheon Museum of American Atrocities in North Korea. And here's our guide telling us about all the terrible things that the Americans do.
Shincheon in North Korea.
In North Korea, yes.
Yeah.
And right behind him is
a picture.
The same Princess Royal, the same steamship. And so the idea that it's a steamship is widespread, but it simply wasn't. All the contemporary accounts say it's a sailing vessel. It's a schooner. It's not a steamship.
So how'd they make it up the Taedong River? They must have had great navigation.
It's amazing.
Skill.
It's amazing what you can do if you can navigate and tack and sail against the wind and things like that.
Wow.
But also this was a time of heavy rains, and most think that they couldn't have gotten as far as they did in normal circumstances. Second misapprehension was that it's the USS General Sherman. So USS means United States ship, an official American naval vessel. It wasn't. It was a private venture. It had nothing to do with
General Sherman.
Yeah, nothing to do with the American Navy. And yet many textbooks in both North and South Korea, and some English language textbooks as well, regard this as somehow as an official American venture, sent by the American government, when there was just no connection. There's no evidence the American government even knew that this was going on until it was over.
Just the general's name on it.
Yes, seems to give it
official status of some kind.
And then finally, the idea that at the time that Koreans recognized this ship as American is a misapprehension. Because if you look at the Korean records, the local officials would say, this strange ship is sailing up our river, and we meet with them and we tell them to go away, and they don't go away, but here's what we see and here's what we observe. None of them characterize this as American.
Oh, really?
The owner of the ship was an American, and he was on board. The captain was an American, and he was on board. But neither of them could speak any Korean or Chinese, and so when the Koreans would actually interact with people, they either interacted with a Welsh missionary, who's named Robert Jermaine Thomas, who could speak some Korean, or they interacted with the Chinese crew, who they could write pen talks with. And so, though there are some Korean records that say, yes, there's this guy Preston on board, and there's this guy Page on board, they don't say these guys are in charge. They don't say this is an American ship. And in fact, most of the Korean records just say it's a foreign ship. When the Koreans officially reported on this to China, they actually said, we have no idea about any American ship. There was this strange French ship that sailed up the river. But it was only because the United States government kept asking Korea about the General Sherman that finally it became all these other possible identities of it. British, Chinese, missionary, you name it. They all disappear and it becomes an American venture.
Within a few years?
Yes.
Afterward?
Yes.
Wow.
And then one final one that you alluded to before, the contemporary Korean records at the time indicate that the local Korean populace and the local soldiers are responsible for destroying the ship. And so usually it's kind of a faceless group. It's a group of really angry Koreans that destroy the ship. And then if there's any single hero that emerges from this, it's an army officer by the name of Park Chung-kwon, who actually snuck onto the ship and rescued a Korean hostage. And so in the older accounts, he's the hero. This daring man who swims ashore. In North Korea, in the early days, in the 50s and 60s, it's the same thing. It's the Korean people, the masses, and the brave Park Chung-kwon. But then in the late 1960s, when you start to see the cult of personality of Kim Il-sung taking shape, suddenly a new hero emerges.
Kim Il-sung's
great-grandfather, Kim Il-woo, who is given credit with devising the plan to use fire ships to destroy the General Sherman, of leading all the Korean people together because of his charisma and his patriotism. And now he has become the only the central, the only hero in the story.
Really?
Of course, there's zero contemporary evidence to support this, but in North Korea, he is the hero now.
Well, this has been wonderful, and my theme is the frog outside the well. That is to say, looking at things differently, and this certainly is a different look at the famous General Sherman incident. Wow! Thanks very much. That was really, really interesting. We'll see you again next time.
Thank you.